Hi, I'm making a video about dating old glasses, drinking glasses. This is the third time I've tried to make it. It's hard not to make it a confusing video because there are so many exceptions to the rules, and although you have sort of reasonable brackets, some of the brackets overlap, and as I say, there are exceptions. So just bear that in mind. It's part of the challenge, but hopefully this will help you. We'll start on the left here. This is my oldest, probably my oldest glass. Has what's called a rough pontil mark. That's this circular area. It's actually super sharp right on the edge here. And if I turn the glass around, you see how sort of rough and crude that is. You'll see that as we go towards newer glasses, whenever there's a change, it's either to make the glass more refined and more aesthetic, or it's moving towards a cheaper process. So that's called a rough pontil. Probably, if you see this, your glass is earlier than mid-1820s. They started to grind these out into a smooth pit, which I'll show you in a second. But really old glasses will have this. Even, you could even have like a 1700s glass if you find this kind of mark. But this one I think is probably early 1800s. Now, just to make it a little bit confusing, apparently in some rare cases they go up to about 1850, but if you find this, it's almost certainly before 1850 and probably 1820s or earlier. I'm not going to talk about 1700 style glasses because there's actually more information on those. They're seemingly easier to date. Mostly what I'm looking at is 1800s pieces. Okay, so here we have a ground out, and hopefully you can see those sort of, this is actually a bit odd because they've almost done two pits, but you see those very smooth areas where they've ground out this rough mark here. And I'm showing this piece just as a reminder that some old glass is coloured. And on this one you also see that it's ground out right in the middle here. It's a little right in here. It's a little more neatly done in the case of this glass, and when you feel it, it's just so silky smooth in there. Same with this one. So this process started in general in the early 1800s. It actually started in 1780 officially, but I think maybe that was just for some higher end pieces. As a general rule, you're talking, starting to see this around 1800, and it only goes up to about 1860 or maybe 1865 as a general rule. So it's a fairly narrow bracket. When I see this, I sort of think, it's probably 1820 to 1860 on average. Could be just outside those brackets, but moving along, still looking at the bases, we now have what looks like a letter T. It's normally not a perfect right angle. You see that there? And this is a fairly common thing to find. Here's another one. Sometimes they're very easy to see. I think this is the, I have a really crude one, I didn't bring it out. Generally you get something like this. It almost looks like a J. This one has a bit of a different angle. And you can even find it on something like a vase like this. I try not to topple it over. See there? This is where it gets confusing because some people refer to that as a gadget mark, but I don't think that it is a gadget mark. It's just something you see at about the same time period. So remember, these pontils stopped, especially the ground one, stopped at about 1860, 1865. Then we switch over to the T. So this begins at about 1860, 1865, and it goes up till at the latest about 1900, because that's when the gadget stopped being used. And it seems like even though this might not be caused by the gadget, it was contemporaneous with that that device. The gadget was basically something that would grip the glass like that. So it was a mechanical grip instead of having it welded to the rod, which is what would have been done for these glasses. From what I've read, this is not a gadget mark, this T. This was made when they would use special shears to cut off a blob of glass. I presume they must have had a blob of glass on the foot at some point. Again, there's a bit of a question mark over exactly what left that impression. And sometimes they're quite rough, and sometimes they're almost slightly welded in appearance, like they're sort of smoothed out a bit, which means that they probably went into the furnace for some polishing or something, fire polishing, after that step was done. So if you see that, broadly 1860 to 1900, I lean towards thinking it may actually be more towards 1860, so more like 1860, 1880, because of what you see on pieces which I'm pretty sure are a little bit more modern than these ones is you move away from, and this is going to be very hard to show you, you move away from the T, but you have this kind of, it's kind of a lumpy sort of a pattern, but there's a swirl in it. See that sort of motley sort of look? And you can just see on the left that sort of swirl. There it is. See on the left of the center, that swirl? It actually hooks right around. I can't quite get it in the light. But that sort of mottled look. And there's normally a swirl on one side of it. Let's look at this one. This one you can see that little C shape? It's about here. If I just tilt the glass again, that's a bit of the swirl that's just a little bit more, so it's more sharply defined. And that's normally the case. You see some mottled or a textured look, and then a swirl that has one bit that's a little bit easy to see. And again, so I said this was a confusing area. People say that this is also associated with the gadget. I don't think that it is. And I've also seen at least one quote on an internet forum that apparently someone was told by an expert at an antiques place that these are contemporaneous with the T. I think these are a bit later. So I think these start in the late 1800s, and probably they might sort of mostly go away by the early 1900s, but at least in some cases they go into the 1900s. And to try and illustrate that, I have some pieces here. It's not the same kind of swell, like it's not quite as mottled, it's a little more refined, but there is still some of those strange marks. So it's a similar kind of process. Now this glass also has a Webb and Corbett maker's mark. It's right here. I won't try and show it, but the point is the maker's mark dates this glass to 1930s or 1940s, basically. So I guess you're almost in the mid 20th century by then. And I have another one here. It's a different pattern, but same It's not the classic swirl, but it's something like that in the middle. And again, it has a maker's mark, so this brings this to the 1930s, 1940s. But in general, that more textured appearance with the swirl, a sort of tight kind of a swirl, is more, I think, very probably late 1800s. Okay, so we've gone from early 1800s to early to mid 1800s, now sort of mid to late 1800s and probably late 1800s. So that's the progression that we've made. Now we get to 1900s mid-century pieces, and there's no swirling, there's no T mark, there's nothing really. Just ignore the maker's mark for a sec. If you rub your finger across it, especially if you do it this way, where the stem is, it just bulges out a little bit, and that tells me it's a modern piece. So this is, you know, could be like a 60s or 70s piece, 1960s or 70s. Here's another one, and if I put my finger over it, I just feel that it's almost like a button. It just sort of rises up right underneath where the stem is. No marks, no swirl, no T. And here's another Stuart crystal piece from probably the 60s, and it rises up again. And if you do have a maker's mark, you can look the maker's marks up on the internet. So Stuart crystal and web core, but they're easily found on the internet. You can date those pretty roughly, but the point is we're trying to just get a rough idea where we're at. So that's the base. I think what I'll do is I'll stop this video, and now I'll make a part 2 looking at the other signs.